And so I'll just kind of go through all the information, and like I said, I'll ask it one more time. I just started the recorder. Are you okay with that I record this?
That's fine.
Okay, awesome. So the beginning of it's kind of broken into sections. So the first one is just kind of demographics and some background of you and the work that you've done. So tell me a little bit about your background and training as it relates to sport and being a coach developer.
Always been involved in sport for as long as I can remember. My first degree was in PE.
Mm-hmm.
I think you call that phys ed, don't you?
Yeah, a lot of names for it.
And then I came over to the States on a scholarship. I did my master's while I was doing that, and then got into coaching quite young, actually, because I got injured and couldn't compete anymore. Mm-hmm. So I got into coaching swimming very early. Had a great time over in the States, came back to the UK, started coaching then, and when I got back into, I suppose, education, I decided that actually the coaches weren't getting a very good deal in terms of coach education. Mm-hmm. So I went into what I would suppose at that point would be coach education, and that's since changed into what I would call more of a coach developer role.
Okay.
Is that enough for you?
Yeah, and I have some other probes I can ask going into that. So you described yourself as a coach developer. Do you work with primarily one sport, or are you working in a number of different sports?
I'm working across a lot of sports. I am currently coaching in tennis still, but that's mainly working at the club that I actually still play at with youngsters. So I'm doing that as a coach, but I've been working as a coach developer across a wide range of sports, individual and team sports.
Great. That covers a lot of some of the follow-up I was going to ask. How long? And you said you got into coaching early. How long have you been working with coaches, maybe in more of a coach developer role?
I did you become a tutor over here for coach education and coach development. When I did it, it was called coach education, but now it's kind of changed into coach development. And I did that in probably, I think, round about 94. Would that be about right?
Okay.
Yeah, probably then. I'd been doing it before that, but I probably got into it more full-time at that point as a job, but also something I did outside my job then, because I'd actually stopped coaching at that point, swimming full-time. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Excellent. So I'm going to move into some of the more coach developer philosophy and foundational questions. How would you define coaching education and coaching development?
Now you're assuming, because of what I said earlier, that there's a difference.
I think this one is intentionally vague, and the follow-up is if they differentiate between the two. I'd like to hear what you say or what you feel the differences are.
Well, what I would say would be very simple. I think that coach education is more about the formal type of coach education, whereas coach development is more about the informal role of helping coaches.
Okay. Let's see. And if you could go a little bit more, because what we're doing is more focused on coach development. Is there anything else you would add to that definition of coach development?
Well, I think by the very nature of the informality of it, it can operate in a number of different ways. You can be working with a group of coaches over one particular type of thing. It can be working with an individual coach over a period of time, but it can also be done on a very much an ad hoc basis as well. So I don't think there is one particular model that I would say that fits a coach developer. I would say it's something that really depends upon the context in which you're operating. And hopefully as a coach developer, you'll be able to pick up on what the needs of the coach are and, I suppose, really work towards that remit rather than having any type of fixed agenda.
Okay. And do you see any benefits to coach development over traditional coaching education?
Oh gosh, where do you want me to start? Absolutely. A lot of the research that I've done in my job has also been around coach education and coach development as well. And I wouldn't say that there is not a place for coach education, but it seems to me from talking to coaches that an awful lot of coaches don't always see the benefit of the formal side of coach education at the time that they get it. Quite often it can be one of two things. It can be a validation of what they do. In other words, they're not learning anything new, but what the coach education course has done is kind of ratified their practice. And the other thing is, I think sometimes at the higher ends of coach education, some of the coaches don't often see where the information that they're getting fits within their coaching until maybe a couple of years later it can be. So that's really kind of what I think about coach education. But as I said, there is a need for it because I think there has to be a way of imparting knowledge. Now, whether the way that it's currently done, and I'm really talking in the UK here, couldn't be improved upon, I would question that, but I think that there is a need for some form of formal requirement of coach education, whereas I think you also have to introduce the notion of coach development, because if you take coaches through the process, which is very formal and very much coach educator led, they tend to expect to be given the information, whereas I think the difference with coach development is you're actually helping the coach to solve the issues for themselves.
Yep.
So it's more of a facilitator or an enabler role. And I think unless you actually introduce that fairly early on in the coach's lifespan or the coach's career, they will tend not to be as receptive of that. They'll always want the answer, whereas I think as a coach developer, it really is important that you say there is no one answer. You know, it's not like that. There could be a range of answers, and it's up to you as the coach to know your athletes and know your situation and know your sport to work out what is the best answer for you in that particular situation.
Excellent. So, kind of continuing with that, what training or professional preparation do you feel that coach developers need in order to be effective? Well,
let me start off by saying I think what the easiest thing would be for me to say was it's not about the sport. For me, coach development is non-sport specific. So you don't need to be a particular, well, whether it be ice hockey like you don't need to be a specialist in that area. I think what you do need to have is you need to have a good understanding of the learning principles. I think you need to understand not just the learning principles, but how they are actually applied in an adult learning situation. Quite often an adult learning situation where somebody has not been through higher education or further education, whether it be ever or for maybe a long period of time.
Okay.
I also think the coach developer has to be a very good communicator. They also have to have empathy, but they also have to be able to pick up on cues. You know, it's kind of relates, I suppose, to what the coach developer is doing with the athlete. The coach developer is doing with the coach. They're presenting options, and I think as a coach, somebody who has been trained, for want is a better word, but educated as a coach developer, that's the type of thing that you need to do. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And are there any other just, and again, you've touched on a number of them, mentioning empathy and, reading cues and communication, but core principles or, kind of those foundational values that you see are important for a coach developer?
Well, I think that's an interesting one, because I think the ones that I mentioned, but also the principles of actually adult learning are hugely important. So I wouldn't want to be too prescriptive, because I think often that's the problem with an awful lot of courses. Once you become too prescriptive, then you're more narrowing it down to what it should be rather than what it could be. And I think that's an important differentiation to make. So I think that if you have that knowledge of learning and how people learn, the ability to put that over but also relate to the other person or people that you're putting it over to, don't really think there's much more you need.
Okay. That's a great place to land that, yeah. Has your philosophy or view of sport ever been in conflict with a coach or an organization that you've worked with?
Absolutely. But then I think that you're always going to have that philosophical, or even I would go as far to say that ethical conflict at times. I mean, to give you an example, while I was working over in the States, I was a GTA at one point. And I'm sure you're familiar with the way that works, but coaches coming to you and saying, I need this athlete to come to play on Saturday, so they need to get such and such a grade for this class. And you don't know who the athlete is because they've never been in your class. That's a bit of a tricky one. So, that's one example, but in a more... I would say that for me, the ethical, philosophical conflicts tend to arise more as a coach with an athlete, or a coach with a parent, or a coach with an organisation. And I think the reason that it hasn't arisen as much as a coach developer is that there are actually few organisations or few guidelines laid down to say what is the actual ethical or philosophical practice of these places. So it is kind of left very much to your own, I suppose, what you want it to be. I'm sure they will arise as these things become more popular, but I'm just trying to think how they might arise, because I actually think when you move from coach education into coach development, which is much more learner oriented in terms of it's not just a straightforward delivery for a kind of pass or fail situation. I think that philosophical and ethical constraints can be talked about, can be discussed, rather than them being an actual blocker on something.
Right, okay. So they're a little bit more fluid and dynamic, because the situation is, you mentioned it's the formal versus the informal setting of a developer versus an educator.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. And so moving on to this next part is going to be a little bit more about best practices and some ideas that you have about that. Can you share with me some tools and methods that you use as a coach developer to establish trust and credibility with coaches?
I think that's a very difficult one to do, because I think the problem is if you don't have trust or have credibility, you can't demand it. Mm-hmm. It's got to be built up over time. It's not something you can go into the first session and say, I demand your trust, or, you're going to have to share things with me. It's all about taking small steps. So if you go in and perhaps meet with people individually and encourage them to share things that are difficult, things that they maybe don't want to talk about in front of other people, and they know after time that these things don't go any further, then the trust will be built up. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a number of things you can do. It depends very much on the context, but it's one of the reasons why, as a coach developer, I think it's very important to get to know the people that you're working with and work with them over an extended period of time. And that, to me, is a big difference between coach education, where it's almost like a huge group where you'll never get to know the names of everyone. Yep. And you're just delivering a set format rather than interacting with people to try and develop empathy or trust. I mean, there are some things you can do to a certain level within a group, but generally speaking, the real trust and the real symbiotic relationship doesn't happen until, I would say, a while into the actual relationship. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. The relationship building, certainly. Let's see. How do you ensure that, and this one's more about, I guess, outcomes, but how do you ensure that adult or coach learning is occurring in that role?
Well, I think there's a number of things that you can do. I mean, it's all very well to say you can see a change in behaviour, and ultimately that is what we want to see. But we want to also know whether that change in behaviour that is occurring in the coaches is actually as a result of what you are working with them on, or whether it's just a fact of them copying you. And I think there is a lot of issue with that, because to me, learning is not always visible. It can be, and that's what you want it to be, but you also have to understand why people are actually showing that learning or showing that behaviour. So in other words, what I would do would be to actually observe them and then speak to them afterwards. More like, I noticed you did X during this session. Can you explain to me why you did that? What you were thinking about, what you noticed while you were doing it. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm just opening a Coke here.
That's all right.
Okay.
All right.
Do you want me to add anything else there?
Nope. I just jotting something down. I'm getting ready for the next one here. Let's see. You've already and some of these you've already covered, so I don't have to go through them too much in depth. Are there any ways that you have found effective in encouraging continued engagement with a coach, or through coach development sessions?
Yeah, what was that?
Are there any ways that you have found to be effective in encouraging a coach to be very engaged in that process you were talking about?
Well, I think it boils down to their motivation, why they're there. I think engagement's another one of these things like trust. If people don't want to be there, if they're told they have to be there by their sports organisation or their head coach, then they usually don't buy into the process quite as much as those people who want to be there because they think they might learn something. So I think the key thing would be to show them how this could be of benefit to them. But then I have to be honest and say that if they don't buy into that, then if they don't engage, then they don't engage.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And that leads right into this next one of how do you handle the stereotype of sport or like the cultural bias and expectation that doesn't appear to value coaching education beyond that very structured and formal setting? How do you kind of create that buy-in?
I think that's a hard one. I would say that over here in the UK, we're actually in a lot of sports getting quite good at that by now.
Mm-hmm.
People have seen the value of that. They've also seen the value of interacting with coaches and coach developers from other sports. So it's not just this whole one sport and that's the only thing about it. People do realise that they can learn from other coaches, mm-hmm. but also from coach developers from other backgrounds.
Okay.
So I think that's quite positive. From what I have seen, though, I'm not so sure that that's the situation in the States. I think you, from my experience, tend to be more about sports and sports organisation and very specific. I mean, it takes time.
Mm-hmm.
If a sport has always done something one way, they are going to take a lot of persuading to make them change that viewpoint. And an awful lot of times it will be because something has happened to make them reevaluate their current practice. And it usually tends to be something quite catastrophic and something
mm-hmm.
quite bad. So, for example, looking at positions in medal tables, looking at positions in world rankings, even things like doping allegations
mm-hmm.
and things like that do tend to make organisations think a bit more deeply about what they're doing. But I think most of the times it's because of something that has befallen them rather than them being forward thinking and saying, maybe we could do this better.
Mm-hmm.
That's certainly been my experience of the way it worked over here.
That's great. It's really helpful. And so, is there a common, I have it listed here as a common struggle, or is there something that you find a lot of coaches, or like a very common barrier that coaches run into as they enter this process of, working with coach development?
Well, I think there can be a couple of them. I think the cross-sport idea is something that is very foreign to mm-hmm. a lot of coaches. So I think that they would question what somebody who didn't have a background in their particular sport could actually offer them. I also think that there is a perception in a lot of sports coaches that if you actually haven't been a performer, an athlete in that particular sport, then again, what can you teach me? Personally, I don't think that's very relevant at all. So I think those are two.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that the other big one from my perception would be, I actually work the same as Kristen in a university.
Mm-hmm.
I am seen as an academic because I write things and
mm-hmm.
coaches don't tend to like to write. So I think there's a natural, what shall we say, a natural coolness to start off with between somebody who they see as very theory driven rather than somebody who's actually based in practice, which if they actually took the trouble to find out, they'd find wasn't true, but mm-hmm. there's an awful lot of assumptions made.
Of course.
So I would say that those three assumptions are the main things. So it's probably would be assumptions would be the main thing,
mm-hmm.
that what coaches come in expecting and what they actually get hopefully are two different things.
Okay. That's really helpful, and it answers some of these other kind of follow-ups that I also have, so I'll try to be a little bit more specific. What is resistance? You talked about resistance a little bit. How about this one? Tell me about a mistake that you have made as a coach developer, like when you first started out.
Gosh. I think one of the things that I would say would be I've probably not taken on board other people's difficulties with some of the new things that we're trying to do within coach development. For example, there's a whole lot more questioning now. There's a whole lot more discussion. And initially, I think people were more used to being given the answer and then having to repeat that answer back. And I think one of the things would be, because that's something that I've never liked, this whole idea of rote learning and just parrot fashion giving the answer back, it's always something that I've been very against. So I think I probably struggled initially to understand that people feel very uncomfortable asking questions, and they also feel quite threatened in a discussion, especially, as I mentioned before, as they perceive me as an academic, in other words, somebody who has all the answers, which I hasten to say isn't the case, but it's that whole putting yourself in the coach's shoes without the benefit of the development work that I've done was probably something that I did struggle with at the beginning.
Okay. Excellent. And let's see. As a coach developer, how do you overcome the societal norm that the best athletes are the best coaches, and that coaching is something that you do instead of something you learn?
Well, I think my answer to that would be, imagine yourself as somebody who has been quite ill and in and out of hospital as a patient. Would you then make the best doctor? Because that's the situation that you are asking people to adopt. You know, it's exactly the same situation. So I think that some people will have the skills and the ability to be coaches. I don't think everyone does. I think the very nature of some people in their sport when they reach the top, and there was a very famous and very good Scottish athlete who retired a few years ago and was given a job as a sports development officer and did not keep that for very long because of the background that they had in sport, made them very focused and very competitive, and they could not understand why trying to introduce sport to 5 and 6 year olds that you wouldn't try and get them to do whatever it took to win.
Yep.
So, you know, somebody with that type of mentality probably wouldn't be a good coach and probably wouldn't be a good coach developer. But, you know, for me, the whole situation is ludicrous, but we do go through it. You know, we're always got that. And I'll tell you the other thing that I have certain reservations about. I have certain reservations that top athletes should be fast-tracked into coaching for the same reasons. So, possibly the thing that they don't need to know very much about is their actual sport, but they probably need to know more about how to put that over to other people. And the high-performance environment that usually these athletes are coming from is very different from a lot of other environments that they might initially be coaching in.
Excellent. I'm going to go back real quick on one that I passed over. But as a coach developer, how do you practice what you teach? In other words, what ways do you engage in critical reflection? Are there any tools or systems that you have in place that help you continue to improve and continue to learn?
Well, I think you should ask Kristen about my stance on critical thinking skills for coaches. She'll tell you that I talk about that all the time, and I think that's something that's sadly neglected. I think that we're in the situation right now where we have a massive amount of information about any subject that we want at our fingertips. But what we need to have is some sort of filter to enable us to select what is relevant for us and our particular situation at that time, and just get rid of the rest because they're far too much. So these critical reflection skills are vital. First, to sift out all that extraneous information that we don't need, but also to allow us to focus in very clearly on our own practice. And an awful lot of people don't like to do that because it's uncomfortable. There are a number of models that I use and I have used for reflection for myself, and that I also work with coaches too. And usually we start off fairly simply with one of the easier models that enables them to go through a process which helps them to get to grips with reflection. And I've done that a number of times, but the model that I use now is really just two questions, and the question would be the so what question. Okay, we've done that, so what? So what happened? What was the result? And then the next question would be now what? So we've already looked at that, now what are we going to do to change that, to make it better, to improve it? So, but I do still go back to some of the earlier models that I've used as well, just at various points. So I suppose quite model driven.
Okay. Excellent. And so just kind of transitioning into the last part, talking about the future of coach development. What cultural changes have you seen regarding coaching education and development and professionalism as you've worked in this field?
Oh, huge changes. Huge changes. I still think that, as I said earlier, there are some sports that don't want to embrace that cultural change, but I would say that social media has made things easier to share, and that's made a huge difference in people being able to talk and share more readily with others. And I think that it allows you to develop networks of people that you can talk to much more easily, and also stay in touch with them more. I mean, when I was over in the States, initially we didn't have all these types of social media that are available now, so it was more things like phone call and letter, and meeting up with people when you were able to. But nowadays, it's just so much easier. So that's been a huge cultural shift, I think. And I think as a result of that, an awful lot of cultures have changed because they can take on board aspects of another system because they can get access to it much more easily.
Interesting. And tell me what you think the field is going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, I suppose it depends. It depends who's in charge, doesn't it?
Yes.
I mean, an awful lot of these things are dependent upon, as I said earlier, people being able to talk and discuss things. So I suppose that does depend to a certain degree on politics at the highest level. And I would say that the UK and the US are in a very difficult situation with that at the moment, and that's the only thing I'll say about that. But the other thing would be, it also depends upon money. And I think that comes from the political system too, certainly more over here. than I'm understand that it does over in the States. So if you want a system to develop, it needs money to be able to do that. So unless we have the political will to get that money in place and make sure it's going to the right place, I'm not so sure that there's going to be a huge evolution. I hope there will be, but I just don't know whether there will be. There will always be some well-intentioned people who want to do the right thing, but, you know, there are some, should we say, coach development courses on offer at the moment, but they are always time barred because of money.
Mm-hmm.
And unless we can find some way of taking the good points out of them and finding some way to make them less expensive and being able to roll them out to countries who are as well developed in terms of their sports structure and also their economic structure as the US and the UK,
mm-hmm.
but also take on board countries who are not that well developed at all. So I'm not so sure that there will be a huge wholesale change in the next 5 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
I hope there will be, but I'm not convinced.
And a lot of those factors will determine whether or not it's embraced or accepted in a lot of different places.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, that's where the political buy-in is so important.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And usually the money follows that as well.
Definitely. What professional recommendations would you have for somebody interested in becoming a coach developer?
Well, I would say great, but it's kind of like coaching in a lot of situations at the moment now. You know, is it going to be enough to support you?
Mm-hmm.
And I think at the moment we do not have that situation where we have a lot of full-time jobs for coach developers. So I would be very hesitant in saying to people, yeah, that's great, it's a full-time career with great prospects, because I just don't think it is at the moment. I'm in a very lucky position in that where I work, I'm able to do the coach development as part of my job and over and above that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not entirely sure that I would encourage people to be coach developers at this stage in time. I think what I would encourage them to be would be full-time coaches, and then see what was happening in the near future after that. Because I think if you're going to be a high-performance coach, there will be opportunities for you. But probably the opportunities after that are going to be more around things like performance directors and athletic directors rather than coach developers. And again, that's where we need that change in outlook. So perhaps that wasn't particularly helpful to you.
No, that was extremely helpful, and I've learned a lot about this process since we've kind of started this work with Dr. Diefenbach and the students in our course. So that's really helpful. And just to kind of wrap up, is there anything else related to coach development that we didn't discuss that you'd like to add in or you think would be helpful?
Not that I could really think of, no.
Okay. Well, I want to just thank you for taking the time out of your Monday and letting me ask you all those questions. If there's anything else you'd like to follow up with, absolutely just get in touch with either myself or Dr. Diefenbach. But yeah, we're really excited to kind of be learning about this and working through it, and really appreciate you being so willing to help.
No problem.
All right.
And if there's anything that I'm not clear about, you can get back in touch, AJ. That's not a problem.
Absolutely, I will do that. Well, thank you so much.
All right.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.